I woke up one morning to find divorce papers on my pillow and my husband of 23 years telling me I was old, useless, and that he'd already moved his 26-year-old secretary into our $1 million dream home while I was visiting my sister. What he didn't know was that the house was entirely in my name, built with my inheritance, and I was about to make it disappear right from under his feet, along with everything he thought he owned. My name is Rebecca. I'm 47 years old, and I never imagined my life would turn into the kind of story you hear about, but never think will happen to you. For 2 decades, I dedicated myself to being the perfect wife, the perfect mother to our 2 children who are now in college, and the perfect partner to a man who I thought loved me as much as I loved him. I gave up my career as an architect to support Michael's ambitions, to raise our kids, to build the home he always said was our shared dream. But apparently, somewhere along the way, I became invisible to him. Just another piece of furniture in the house I designed with my own hands. It was a Tuesday morning in September when everything fell apart. I'd been at my sister Clara's house in Boston for a week, helping her recover from surgery. Michael had been supportive, telling me to take all the time I needed, that he could handle things at home in our suburban Connecticut neighborhood. I should have known something was wrong when he was so eager for me to leave. The morning I returned, I felt something was off the moment I opened the front door. There was a different perfume in the air, expensive and floral, nothing like what I wore. The living room furniture had been rearranged, and there were unfamiliar decorative pillows on the couch I'd carefully selected 3 years ago. If you're connecting with this story, please help this channel grow by clicking that subscribe button. We're working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to making that happen. I walked upstairs slowly, my heart pounding in a way that made my chest feel tight. Our bedroom door was closed, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning when Michael should have been at the office by 8. I pushed it open, and the scene before me felt like something from a nightmare. Michael was there, but he wasn't alone. A young woman with long blonde hair was sitting on my side of the bed, wearing one of my silk robes, painting her nails with a bottle of polish from my vanity. They both looked up at me with expressions that still haunt me. Not guilt, not shame, but annoyance, as if I was the one intruding. Michael stood up, straightening his shirt with a casualness that made my blood run cold. He didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. Instead, he walked over to the dresser and picked up a manila envelope that had been sitting there, clearly prepared for this moment. He handed it to me without a word, and when I opened it with shaking hands, I saw they were divorce papers, already signed by him, just waiting for my signature. The young woman, who I later learned was Amber, his secretary from the marketing firm where he worked as a senior executive, just smiled at me with this smug expression that made me want to scream. That's when Michael said the words that would change everything. He looked at me with these cold eyes I didn't recognize and told me that I'd let myself go, that I was old and useless now that the kids were gone, that he deserved to be happy with someone young and exciting who appreciated him. He said I should be grateful he was willing to let me have half of our savings and that I could find a small apartment somewhere while he kept the house. After all, he said, he was the one who'd been working all these years while I just stayed home. The house, the life we built, our 23 years together, it all meant nothing to him anymore. I stood there in shock, unable to form words, unable to process what was happening. Amber got up from the bed and walked past me, trailing that perfume that now made me nauseous, and said something about making coffee downstairs, in my kitchen, as if she already owned the place. Michael told me I had a week to pack my things and find somewhere else to live, that his lawyer would be in touch, and that I should make this easy on everyone, especially our children. Then he walked out of the bedroom, leaving me standing there alone, surrounded by 23 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to him. Your subscription really helps this channel grow and reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. If this story is resonating with you, please take a moment to click that subscribe button right now. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my shock turned into something else. I walked over to my closet, pulled out the fireproof safe I kept hidden behind my winter coats, and took out the documents I'd stored there years ago. My hands were still shaking, but now it was from rage, not fear. Inside that safe were the original property deeds, the construction permits, the mortgage papers. Every single document related to our beautiful 4-bedroom colonial-style home with its wraparound porch and professional-grade kitchen. And every single one of those documents had only one name on them: Rebecca Ann Morrison, my maiden name that I'd kept for legal purposes even after marriage. You see, 8 years ago when we decided to build our dream home, we sold our starter house and I received a substantial inheritance from my grandmother, nearly $800,000. Michael's credit was terrible back then because of some bad investment decisions he'd made, so we agreed the house would be in my name until his credit recovered. I'd designed every detail of this house myself, using my architectural training that I'd abandoned to support his career. I'd worked with the contractors, chosen every fixture, every paint color, every tile. This house wasn't just where I lived. It was a piece of my soul made tangible. Michael had conveniently forgotten all of this, or perhaps he'd never really valued it in the first place. He assumed that because he'd been the primary earner during our marriage, because his name was on the utility bills and his paychecks had paid for groceries and vacations, that he owned everything. He had no idea that legally the house was entirely mine. The mortgage was in my name, paid down over the years with my inheritance and the rental income from a small commercial property my grandmother had also left me. Michael had never paid attention to our finances beyond his own checking account, always assuming I was just managing household expenses with his money. I walked back downstairs, where I could hear them laughing in the kitchen, probably mocking me, probably celebrating their victory. I went straight to my home office, the small room off the living room where I'd kept all our important documents organized in labeled folders, and I made several phone calls. First, I called my college roommate Jennifer, who'd become a successful divorce attorney in Hartford. Then I called my financial advisor. Then I called a locksmith. And finally, I called my daughter Emma at Cornell and my son Jake at Boston University, because they deserved to hear the truth from me before their father could spin his own version. Please help us reach 1,000 subscribers by clicking that subscribe button. Every subscription brings us closer to our goal and helps stories like this one reach more people who might need to hear them. Both of my children were devastated and furious. Emma cried and told me she'd always thought her father was different, that she'd admired their relationship as an example of lasting love. Jake was angry, asking why his father would throw everything away for someone barely older than Emma. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened, but I couldn't hide the pain in my voice. They both wanted to come home immediately, but I told them to stay at school, to focus on their studies, that I would handle this. What I didn't tell them yet was that I had a plan forming in my mind, a plan that would teach their father exactly what he'd lost. Jennifer arrived at my house within 2 hours, her briefcase in hand, and her expression all business. She sat with me at my kitchen table, the same table where Michael and Amber were probably planning their future together just that morning, and she reviewed all my documents. Her face broke into a slow smile as she realized the position I was in legally. She explained that because the house was solely in my name, purchased with my inheritance, which is considered separate property in Connecticut, Michael had no legal claim to it whatsoever. Even though we'd been married when it was purchased, the fact that only my name was on the deed and mortgage, combined with the paper trail showing my inheritance as the source of funds, meant the house was mine and mine alone. She also explained that because Michael had abandoned the marital home by moving his mistress in without my consent, and because he'd presented me with divorce papers without prior discussion or mediation, he'd actually weakened his own legal position significantly. His actions could be considered constructive eviction, and the fact that he'd done this while I was away caring for a sick family member made it even worse. Jennifer's eyes sparkled with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from taking on a case you know you're going to win. She told me she'd file a response to his divorce petition by the end of the week, and that I should document everything. Every text message, every interaction, every witness who could confirm what he'd done. The locksmith arrived while Jennifer was still there. I had him change every lock on every door of my house, including the garage, the side entrance, and even the locks on the gate to our backyard. Michael had taken his keys with him when he'd left for work that morning, probably thinking he could come and go as he pleased while gradually pushing me out. He was in for a surprise when he tried to come home that evening. Jennifer advised me to also change the security system code and to set up cameras, which I did that same afternoon, installing a complete system that would record every entrance to the property. If you're finding this story compelling, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. We're building a community here and working toward that first 1,000 subscribers, and you can be part of that by clicking the subscribe button. Michael came home around 6:30 that evening. I watched him on the new security camera as he tried his key in the front door, his face showing confusion when it didn't work. He tried again, then walked around to the side door, then to the garage. I could see his confusion turning to anger as he realized none of his keys worked. He started banging on the front door, calling my name, demanding I let him in. His voice had that edge to it that I'd heard before when things didn't go his way at work. That entitled anger of someone who's used to being in control. I waited a few minutes before I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged so he could only see me through the gap. His face was red, and I could smell the cologne he'd apparently started wearing recently. Something musky and obvious that wasn't like him at all. Or at least not like the man I thought I'd known. He demanded to know why I'd changed the locks, told me I had no right to lock him out of his own house, threatened to call the police. I stayed calm, calmer than I'd felt all day, and I told him through that narrow opening that this wasn't his house. It was my house, and he was no longer welcome here. The confusion on his face was almost comical. He sputtered something about how we'd built this house together, how he'd paid for everything, how I couldn't just kick him out. I smiled, and I told him to check the property records, to look at the deed, to review the mortgage documents. I told him that every single legal document related to this property had only my name on it, that the house had been purchased with my inheritance, and that legally he had no claim to it whatsoever. I watched as understanding slowly dawned on his face, followed by panic. He tried to change tactics, suddenly becoming conciliatory, saying we could work this out, that we didn't need to involve lawyers, that maybe he'd been hasty this morning. But I was done. I told him that my attorney would be in touch with his, that all further communication should go through her, and that if he tried to enter my property again without permission, I would call the police and have him arrested for trespassing. His face went from red to purple, and he started yelling, threatening to take everything from me, to turn our children against me, to ruin me financially. I just closed the door in his face and locked it, then watched on the security camera as he stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened, before eventually getting back in his car and driving away. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in a week, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was quiet, just mine, and I realized that I hadn't felt this calm in years. I'd been walking on eggshells for so long, trying to keep Michael happy, trying to stay relevant in his eyes, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just breathe without worry. That realization made me both sad and angry. Sad for all the years I'd wasted trying to please someone who clearly didn't value me, and angry that I'd let it happen for so long. Please consider subscribing to help us build this community and reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support makes these stories possible and helps them reach others who might need to hear them. Over the next few days, Jennifer moved quickly. She filed a response to Michael's divorce petition that detailed his adultery, his abandonment of the marital home, and his attempt to fraudulently claim ownership of property that wasn't his. She also filed for exclusive use of the marital residence, for spousal support based on the length of our marriage and my career sacrifice, and for a significant portion of his retirement accounts and other marital assets. She subpoenaed his financial records, his phone records, and even started investigating whether he'd used any marital funds to support his affair with Amber, which would be considered dissipation of marital assets under Connecticut law. Michael's attorney was apparently blindsided by all of this. According to Jennifer, he'd advised Michael that it would be a straightforward divorce, where they'd split everything 50-50, with Michael keeping the house and most of the assets while I got a modest settlement. Now they were facing a situation where not only was Michael not getting the house, he was looking at potentially owing me substantial spousal support and having to split his retirement accounts and other assets with me. Jennifer said his attorney had called her twice trying to negotiate, but she told him we weren't interested in negotiating until they provided full financial disclosure, and Michael moved out of any property he was claiming as marital residence with his mistress. It turned out that Michael had moved into a luxury apartment with Amber, one of those high-rise buildings downtown with a doorman and a view of the river, and he was paying for it entirely with his income. Jennifer argued that this showed he had sufficient resources to maintain his lifestyle without the house, and that his decision to voluntarily take on these expenses while trying to force me out of my home demonstrated his financial capability to pay spousal support. The judge agreed with her preliminary arguments and issued a temporary order granting me exclusive use of the house and ordering Michael to pay temporary spousal support while the divorce was pending. Michael was furious. He started sending me angry text messages, which I forwarded to Jennifer, who used them as further evidence of his hostile behavior. He tried to turn up at the house several more times, always when he thought I might be vulnerable, late at night or early in the morning. But the security cameras caught everything and I never answered the door. He even tried to use our children to get to me, calling them and telling them I was being unreasonable, that I was trying to take everything from him, that I'd changed the locks to hurt him. But Emma and Jake had seen through him by then, especially after Emma did some digging and found out that Amber wasn't just some random secretary. She'd been working with Michael for over 2 years, and there were rumors at his office that they'd been involved for at least 18 months. If this story is speaking to you, please subscribe to our channel. We're so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us continue sharing these important stories with people who need to hear them. The discovery phase of the divorce was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Jennifer's team uncovered that Michael had been spending marital funds on Amber for over a year. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways, jewelry, even a used Mercedes that was registered in Amber's name but paid for with money from our joint account. All of this added up to over $60,000 that he'd essentially stolen from our marriage to fund his affair. Under Connecticut law, this was clear dissipation of marital assets, and the judge would likely order him to reimburse the marital estate for these amounts, which would come out of his share of any settlement. They also discovered that Michael had been hiding income. He'd been doing consulting work on the side, bringing in an additional $30,000 to $40,000 a year that he'd been depositing into a separate account I didn't know about. This changed the calculation for spousal support significantly, as his actual income was much higher than he'd claimed. Jennifer filed amended documents reflecting this new information, and Michael's attorney was scrambling to explain why his client had failed to disclose this income initially. But the most satisfying discovery came when Jennifer's investigator looked into Amber's background. It turned out that this wasn't her first affair with a married man from the office. She'd been involved with another senior executive at Michael's firm about 3 years ago, an affair that had ended when the man's wife found out and threatened to sue the company for allowing a hostile work environment. Amber had been quietly moved to a different department afterward, which is how she'd ended up as Michael's secretary. Jennifer obtained sworn statements from 2 other employees at the firm who confirmed the pattern of behavior, which we plan to use to demonstrate that Michael had engaged in a relationship with someone known to pursue married men, further undermining any sympathy a judge might have for his position. Meanwhile, I was rediscovering myself. Without Michael's constant criticism and negativity, I found myself feeling lighter, younger even. I started exercising again, taking long walks through our neighborhood in the crisp autumn air, watching the leaves turn brilliant shades of orange and red. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, women who told me they'd always felt Michael was controlling, but hadn't wanted to interfere. I even started sketching again, pulling out my old architectural drafting tools and designing spaces, remembering why I'd loved this work before I'd given it up. Emma came home for a long weekend in October, and we spent hours talking about everything. She told me she'd noticed the change in her father over the past couple of years, how he'd become more focused on appearances, more critical of everyone around him, more obsessed with status and youth. She admitted she'd seen him having lunch with Amber once when she'd visited his office, and something about the way they interacted had made her uncomfortable. But she'd pushed the feeling aside, not wanting to believe her father could be unfaithful. Now she felt guilty for not saying something, and I had to reassure her that none of this was her responsibility, that the choices her father made were his alone. Your subscription would mean so much to this channel. We're building something special here, a community of people sharing and learning from real experiences, and we need just 1,000 subscribers to really take off. Please click that subscribe button. Jake came home a few weeks later for Thanksgiving, and I decided to host a real celebration despite everything that had happened. I invited Clara and her family, my parents who'd driven up from Florida, and a few close friends. It was the first Thanksgiving in years where I didn't feel stressed about everything being perfect for Michael, about making sure his favorite dishes were prepared exactly right, about managing his moods if something wasn't to his liking. Instead, I cooked what I wanted to cook. I decorated how I wanted to decorate, and I filled my home with people who actually cared about me. Michael tried to insert himself into the holiday by calling both kids multiple times, complaining that I was keeping him away from family traditions, painting himself as the victim. But Emma and Jake had already made their positions clear to him. They told him he was welcome to have a relationship with them, but not if he expected them to pretend that what he'd done was okay, and not if he kept trying to villainize me. They told him they'd meet him for lunch or coffee individually, but they were spending Thanksgiving with me, in my house, the house he'd tried to steal. The divorce proceedings continued through the winter. Michael's attorney tried several tactics to delay or derail the process, but Jennifer was relentless. She had the evidence, she had the law on her side, and she had a client who was finally standing up for herself after years of being diminished. By February, it became clear to Michael's legal team that they were fighting a losing battle. Every attempt to claim the house failed because the documentation was ironclad. Every attempt to reduce spousal support failed because the evidence of his income and his dissipation of marital assets was undeniable. Every attempt to paint me as vindictive or unreasonable failed because we had documented his abandonment, his adultery, and his attempts to defraud me of my property. In March, they finally offered a settlement. Michael would give up any claim to the house. He would pay me spousal support for 15 years, or until I remarried or cohabitated with someone else. He would split his retirement accounts with me 50-50, and he would reimburse the marital estate for the funds he'd dissipated on his affair. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue any claims against Amber or his employer, and we would agree to joint legal custody of our adult children, which was meaningless since they were adults, but apparently important to Michael's ego. Jennifer advised me it was a good offer, better than we might get if we went to trial, so I accepted. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for listening. Please consider subscribing to help us reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone. It's people like you who make this channel possible. The divorce was finalized in April, 8 months after that terrible morning when I'd found Michael and Amber in my bedroom. The day the judge signed the final decree, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and possibility. I was no longer defined by being Michael's wife, no longer living in the shadow of his expectations and criticisms. I was just Rebecca, 47 years old, with a beautiful home that was entirely mine, financial security, and a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. Michael's life didn't go quite as smoothly. His affair with Amber fizzled out within 6 months of our separation. According to Emma, who heard through the office grapevine, Amber had expected Michael to shower her with expensive gifts and lavish attention once he was free from his marriage, but between the legal fees, the spousal support, and the asset division, Michael's financial situation was much tighter than either of them had anticipated. She apparently moved on to greener pastures, leaving Michael alone in that expensive downtown apartment, realizing too late what he'd thrown away. His relationship with our children remained strained. They were cordial with him, but the easy closeness they'd once shared was gone. Emma told me that when she tried to talk to him about what had happened, he couldn't take responsibility for his actions, instead blaming me for being too demanding, for letting myself go, for not being exciting enough. He couldn't see that he'd destroyed his family for a fantasy, and that the problem wasn't that I'd changed, but that he had, becoming shallow and selfish and willing to hurt everyone who loved him for his own gratification. As for me, I threw myself into rediscovering who I was outside of being a wife and mother. I started taking architectural design classes again at the community college, updating my skills with new software and techniques. I connected with a former colleague from my pre-marriage career who had her own small firm, and she offered me contract work, small residential projects that I could work on from home. It felt incredible to be creating again, to be using my brain for something other than managing a household and supporting someone else's ambitions. I also started dating, though cautiously. I went out with a few men I met through friends or online, nothing serious, just rediscovering what it felt like to be appreciated and desired. There was a divorced history professor named David, who took me to museum exhibitions and actually listened when I talked about my interests. There was a widowed architect named Thomas, who understood my passion for design and encouraged me to pursue my career. None of these relationships became serious, but they reminded me that I was still attractive, still interesting, still had value as a person beyond my role as someone's wife. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support can help us get there. Please take a moment to click that subscribe button and join this growing community. The house, my beautiful house that Michael had tried to take from me, became more than just a place to live. It became a symbol of my independence, my strength, my refusal to let someone else define my worth. I made some changes to it, redecorating the master bedroom completely to erase the memory of that awful morning, turning the guest room into a proper design studio where I could work on my projects, adding a small greenhouse off the kitchen where I could indulge my newfound interest in gardening. Every change I made felt like I was reclaiming the space, making it truly mine rather than ours. Emma graduated that May, and we held her graduation party at the house. She'd decided to pursue a master's degree in public policy, passionate about making a difference in the world in a way that made me incredibly proud. Jake was thriving at Boston University, studying environmental science and talking about pursuing a PhD. Both of them seemed to have escaped their father's crisis relatively unscathed, though I knew they carried some scars from watching their parents' marriage implode. But they also told me that seeing me stand up for myself, seeing me rebuild my life and rediscover my happiness, had taught them important lessons about self-worth and resilience. I ran into Michael once, about a year after the divorce was finalized. It was at Jake's award ceremony at his university, an event we both attended to support our son. Michael looked older, grayer, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was alone, and when he saw me, I could see a flash of something in his eyes. Regret maybe, or loss. I was there with David, the history professor, who had his hand resting gently on my back in a gesture of support and affection. I smiled politely at Michael, congratulated him on our son's achievement, and turned away. I didn't feel angry anymore, just indifferent, and I think that indifference hurt him more than rage ever could have. The irony wasn't lost on me that Michael had called me old and useless, thinking he could discard me for a younger model and take everything I'd built. Instead, he'd lost the house, lost his financial security, lost his children's respect, and lost the woman who'd loved him unconditionally for over 2 decades. Meanwhile, I was thriving, rediscovering my career, exploring new relationships, and living in the beautiful home I'd designed, the home he thought he could steal. He'd tried to make me disappear, to erase my contributions and my worth, but instead, he'd made himself irrelevant in my life. As I'm recording this story now, it's been almost 2 years since that terrible Tuesday morning that changed everything. I'm 49 years old. I have a growing architectural consulting practice, a beautiful home that's completely paid off and entirely mine, financial security, and most importantly, I have my self-respect back. My children are doing well, pursuing their dreams with the kind of determination and integrity that makes me proud. My relationships with my friends and family are deeper and more authentic than they've been in years. Please help us celebrate reaching our goal of 1,000 subscribers by clicking that subscribe button. Your support means everything to creators like me who are sharing real stories about real challenges and real triumphs. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I spent with Michael. If I feel like I wasted my life on someone who didn't appreciate me. The truth is more complicated than that. I don't regret my marriage entirely because it gave me my children, because there were good years before things went wrong, because I learned valuable lessons about who I am and what I deserve. But I also don't regret standing up for myself when he tried to take everything from me. I don't regret changing those locks, lawyering up, and fighting for what was rightfully mine. I don't regret showing my children that sometimes love means letting go, and that self-worth isn't negotiable. The house Michael tried to make disappear from my life was really just a physical structure, bricks and wood and glass arranged according to my design. But what it represented was my independence, my creativity, my worth, everything he'd tried to diminish over the years. When I made that house legally and permanently mine, when I locked him out and reclaimed my space, I wasn't just keeping a piece of property. I was reclaiming my identity, my dignity, my right to be valued and respected. In trying to take everything from me, Michael inadvertently gave me the greatest gift possible. He forced me to remember who I was before I became his wife, and to realize that woman was still there, still strong, still capable, still deserving of a beautiful life. Today, I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the work I've created with my own hands and mind. I have coffee on the porch I designed, watching the sunrise over the garden I planted. I work on projects that challenge and excite me, using skills I'd almost forgotten I had. I spend time with people who genuinely value me, not for what I can do for them, but for who I am. And sometimes, when I think about Michael in his apartment, probably regretting the choices that cost him everything, I feel a small twinge of pity for him. But mostly, I just feel grateful. Grateful that his cruelty forced me to find my strength. Grateful that his betrayal led me back to myself, and grateful that when he tried to make me disappear, I made him irrelevant instead. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or inspiration, or just a few minutes of connection with someone else's experience, please consider subscribing to this channel. We're building a community here of people who face challenges and come out stronger, and we'd love to have you as part of it as we reach for that 1,000 subscriber goal. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here, for caring, for taking the time to hear about how one woman refused to disappear when someone tried to erase her. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. Relationships don't always last forever, and people we love sometimes reveal themselves to be different than we thought. But we always have a choice in how we respond, whether we let ourselves be diminished or whether we stand up and fight for what's ours, not just property and money, but our dignity, our worth, our right to a life that honors who we are. I chose to fight, and I won, not just in court, but in the more important battle of reclaiming my sense of self. And if you're facing something similar, I hope my story reminds you that you're stronger than you think, that you deserve better than someone who doesn't see your value, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well and refusing to be erased. Looking back now, I realize that the end of my marriage wasn't really a sudden catastrophe, but rather the culmination of years of slow erosion that I'd been too busy or too scared to acknowledge. There were signs long before that Tuesday morning, small moments that should have told me something was fundamentally wrong in my relationship with Michael, but I'd explained them away, or convinced myself they were normal parts of a long marriage. I think about those signs now, not to torture myself with what I should have noticed, but to remind myself to never ignore my instincts again. About 3 years before everything fell apart, Michael started working later and later at the office. He'd always been dedicated to his career. That was something I'd admired about him when we first met. But this was different. He'd come home at 9 or 10 at night, sometimes even later, smelling of cologne I didn't recognize and offering vague explanations about client meetings or project deadlines. When I'd suggest bringing him dinner at the office or surprising him with a visit, he'd get irritated, telling me he needed to focus and that I'd be a distraction. At the time, I thought I was being supportive by giving him space, by not being the nagging wife who couldn't understand career demands. Now I understand he was building a separate life that didn't include me. He also became increasingly critical of everything about me during those years. My clothes were too frumpy. My hair was too long or too short depending on the week. I'd gained weight, even though I weighed exactly the same as I had for 15 years. My interests were boring. My friends were tedious. Every criticism was delivered with this tone of helpful concern, as if he was doing me a favor by pointing out my flaws so I could improve myself. I started second-guessing everything, spending hours trying on different outfits before we'd go out, analyzing every conversation I had at social events to make sure I hadn't embarrassed him, apologizing for things that weren't even my fault, just to avoid his disapproval. If you're still with me on this journey, please consider subscribing to help us build this community. Every subscription gets us closer to our goal of 1,000 subscribers and helps ensure these stories reach people who need to hear them. The intimacy in our marriage had dried up long before the divorce. Michael always had an excuse for why he was too tired or too stressed, and eventually I stopped initiating anything because the rejection hurt too much. I told myself it was normal, that after 20 years together the passion naturally faded, that we were just comfortable with each other. But comfortable isn't the right word for what we were. We were distant, like roommates who happened to share a last name and a mortgage. He'd scroll through his phone while I tried to talk to him about my day. He'd schedule golf games and guys' nights without checking if I had any plans. He'd make major decisions about vacations or large purchases without consulting me, and then act surprised when I felt left out. Our children had noticed too, though they didn't say anything until after the divorce. Emma told me she'd come home from college during her sophomore year and been shocked by how little her parents seemed to actually talk to each other. She said we moved through the house like ghosts haunting the same space, but never really connecting. Jake admitted he'd been relieved to go away to college, partly because the tension at home had become so uncomfortable, even though nothing obvious was wrong. Just this pervasive sense that his parents didn't really like each other anymore. The months following the finalization of the divorce brought unexpected challenges that I hadn't anticipated. The practical side of being single after 23 years of marriage was sometimes overwhelming. I had to learn how to manage things Michael had always handled, like the lawn equipment and the snowblower, the backup generator and the complex sprinkler system. I had to figure out my own taxes as a newly single person with multiple income streams. I had to make all the decisions about everything without anyone to consult or to share the mental load with, which was simultaneously liberating and exhausting. But there were also moments of pure joy that I hadn't experienced in years. I could eat dinner at 9 at night if I wanted to, or have breakfast for dinner, or decide not to cook at all and just eat cheese and crackers in front of the television. I could watch whatever I wanted without negotiating or compromising. I could leave dishes in the sink overnight without someone making passive-aggressive comments about it in the morning. I could invite friends over spontaneously without worrying about whether Michael would be in a good mood or whether he'd embarrass me by being cold to people he deemed beneath him. Your subscription would really help this channel grow and reach more people with these stories. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference. Please click that subscribe button. I started traveling too, something Michael and I had rarely done together because he always found reasons why it wasn't a good time or wasn't practical. In the fall, about 18 months after the divorce, I took a solo trip to Italy, something I'd dreamed about since I was a college student studying architecture. I spent 2 weeks wandering through Florence and Rome and Venice, sketching buildings and taking photographs and eating amazing food, and just existing in my own company without apology or explanation. I met other travelers, had conversations with interesting people from all over the world, and realized that I was actually quite good at being alone, that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness. On that trip, I met a British architect named Graham, who was in Rome researching Baroque churches for a book he was writing. We started chatting at a cafe near the Pantheon, bonding over our shared love of architectural history, and ended up spending 3 days exploring the city together. It wasn't romantic, though there was definitely a spark of attraction between us, but it was meaningful in a different way. He treated me like an intellectual equal, asked my opinions about design elements and historical context, listened when I spoke, and built on my ideas rather than dismissing them. It reminded me that I actually had interesting things to say, that my years of study and practice hadn't been erased by my years of domestic focus. Graham and I stayed in touch after that trip, exchanging emails about projects we were working on and sharing articles we thought the other would find interesting. He eventually invited me to speak at a small architectural conference in London about sustainable residential design, and even though I was terrified because I hadn't spoken publicly about architecture in over 20 years, I accepted. Standing in front of that room of professionals, presenting ideas I'd developed through my recent consulting work, receiving thoughtful questions and genuine interest in my perspective, I felt a piece of myself clicking back into place that I hadn't even realized was missing. Please help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers by taking a moment to click that subscribe button. Your support means everything to this channel and helps these stories find the people who need them most. Meanwhile, Michael's situation continued to deteriorate in ways that I only heard about through occasional updates from Emma and Jake. After Amber left him, he apparently tried dating several other younger women, each relationship following the same pattern of intense initial attraction, followed by rapid disillusionment when they realized he wasn't the wealthy, carefree bachelor he'd presented himself as. He was still paying me substantial spousal support every month. His retirement accounts had been cut in half, and he was carrying significant debt from the divorce legal fees. The lifestyle he'd imagined having with Amber, the penthouse apartment and expensive vacations and luxury car, wasn't sustainable on his actual income. His career had suffered too. The company where he'd worked for 15 years had been less than pleased about the scandal of a senior executive having an affair with his secretary, especially after the pattern of Amber's previous behavior came to light. They didn't fire him, but he was quietly passed over for a promotion he'd been counting on, and his role was gradually diminished until he was essentially a mid-level manager, rather than the senior executive he'd been. The consulting work he'd been hiding was also affected because many of those contracts had come through personal connections, and once word got around about what he'd done to his family, some of those relationships cooled significantly. Jake told me about having lunch with his father about 2 years after the divorce, and Michael had spent most of the meal complaining about how unfair everything was, how he'd lost everything, how his life had fallen apart. Jake had finally lost his patience and pointed out that Michael hadn't lost everything. He'd thrown it away deliberately. He'd had a wife who loved him, children who respected him, a beautiful home, financial security, and he'd risked all of it for an affair with someone who'd only been interested in what he could give her materially. Jake said Michael had gotten angry at that, accusing Jake of taking my side, of not understanding how suffocating the marriage had been, how I'd let myself go and become boring. Jake had left the lunch early and didn't speak to his father for several months after that. Emma's relationship with Michael was similarly strained. She'd tried harder than Jake to maintain a connection, believing that everyone deserved forgiveness and second chances, but she'd finally reached her limit when Michael tried to guilt her into asking me to reduce the spousal support payments. He'd told her he was struggling financially, that I was being vindictive and greedy, that surely after 2 years I could get a full-time job and support myself instead of taking his money. Emma had done the research and discovered that the spousal support amount had been calculated based on standard formulas, considering the length of our marriage, my career sacrifice, and his income, and that it was actually quite reasonable. When she'd confronted him about lying to manipulate her, he'd accused her of being disrespectful and hung up on her. The thing that struck me most about hearing these stories about Michael's ongoing struggles was that I felt almost nothing. Not satisfaction at his suffering, not guilt that my choices had contributed to his difficulties, not even much curiosity about the details of his life. He'd become irrelevant to me in a way that felt surprisingly complete. For so many years, my emotional state had been tied to his moods and opinions, and now he was just someone I used to know, someone I occasionally had to coordinate with regarding our adult children, nothing more. If this story is speaking to your experience, please subscribe to our channel. We're building toward 1,000 subscribers and creating a space for real stories about real challenges and triumphs. My consulting work grew steadily during this time. What had started as small residential projects, additions and renovations for friends of friends, expanded into larger commissions. I designed a community center for a small Connecticut town, a sustainable office building for a nonprofit organization, a series of affordable housing units that incorporated innovative green design elements. Each project felt like a validation of my skills and vision, proof that the years I'd spent away from architecture hadn't diminished my abilities, but had actually given me a different perspective that clients valued. The woman I'd reconnected with, my former colleague Diane, who ran her own firm, eventually proposed a partnership. She specialized in commercial projects while my strength was residential and community design, and she thought we could build something significant together. I was hesitant at first, worried about taking on that level of commitment and responsibility, but she believed in me in a way that was impossible to ignore. We formed Morrison & Associates, and within a year we had a full roster of clients and were hiring junior architects to help with the workload. Having my own architectural firm at age 50 felt surreal and thrilling in equal measure. I'd given up on this dream so long ago, convinced that I'd made my choice, and that returning to this career was impossible. But here I was, my name on the door, leading design meetings and negotiating contracts and mentoring young architects. The work was demanding and sometimes stressful, but it was the kind of stress that comes from caring deeply about what you're creating, not the soul-crushing stress of trying to keep someone else happy at the expense of your own well-being. David, the history professor I'd been seeing casually, became more serious over time. We'd been dating on and off for about a year when he asked me if I'd ever consider remarrying. I was honest with him that I wasn't sure, that the idea of legally binding myself to someone again felt frightening after what I'd been through. He was patient and understanding, telling me there was no pressure, that he was happy with whatever our relationship looked like as long as we were both in it. That patience and respect for my boundaries made me trust him in ways I hadn't thought I'd be able to trust anyone again. We traveled together, taking a road trip through New England one autumn to see the fall foliage and visit historical sites David was researching for a book he was writing. We cooked together in my kitchen, experimenting with new recipes and laughing when things didn't turn out right. We attended concerts and art exhibitions and lectures at the university where he taught. He met my children, and they liked him, appreciated how he treated me with genuine respect and affection, how he encouraged my career ambitions rather than feeling threatened by them. Emma told me once that seeing me with David made her understand what a healthy relationship should look like, that she'd thought the distance and criticism in my marriage to her father was just normal. Please take a moment to subscribe and help us reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone. Every subscription helps stories like this one reach people who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your life. The house, my sanctuary through all of this, continued to evolve with me. I converted Michael's former home office into a library, filling the built-in shelves with books about architecture, history, art, and design. I created a small meditation corner in the sunroom where I could sit in the mornings with my coffee and watch the birds at the feeders I'd installed. I hung my own artwork on the walls, sketches and watercolors I'd created during my travels and quiet evenings at home. Every room reflected my taste, my interests, my vision, no longer compromised or negotiated or adjusted to suit someone else's preferences. I hosted regular gatherings for friends, dinner parties and book clubs and design salons where local architects and artists would gather to discuss projects and share ideas. My home became known as a welcoming space, a place where interesting conversations happened, and where people felt genuinely valued and heard. Several friendships deepened during this time, including one with my neighbor Patricia, who I'd known for years but never really connected with because Michael hadn't liked her husband. Patricia and I started taking long walks together several times a week, talking about everything from our careers to our children to our dreams for the future. She told me she'd watched my transformation over the past few years, and that it had inspired her to make some changes in her own life, to stop accepting things that made her unhappy just because they seemed easier than fighting for change. Emma finished her master's degree and got a job with a think tank in Washington, D.C. focused on housing policy. She was passionate about addressing affordable housing crises and creating more equitable urban planning policies. I loved watching her throw herself into work that mattered to her, seeing her confidence and competence grow, knowing that she was building a life on her own terms rather than in service to someone else's vision. She dated occasionally, but wasn't in any rush to settle down, telling me she wanted to establish her career and really know herself before committing to a serious relationship. I thought that was incredibly wise and told her so. Jake finished his undergraduate degree and did decide to pursue that PhD in environmental science, focusing on climate change adaptation strategies for coastal communities. He was accepted to a program at UC Berkeley with full funding. And though I was sad he'd be so far away, I was thrilled to see him pursuing his passion. He'd also maintained his commitment to only having relationships with people who treated him as an equal partner, something he said he'd learned from watching both his parents' marriage and my recovery from it. He told me that seeing me rebuild my life had taught him that it's never worth sacrificing your own well-being to maintain a relationship that doesn't serve you. Your support would mean so much to this channel. Please consider subscribing to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and continue sharing these important stories with people who need them. About 3 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected phone call from Michael. His voice on the other end of the line sounded older, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He asked if we could meet for coffee, said there were some things he needed to say to me. I was hesitant, worried it was some kind of manipulation or attempt to renegotiate the divorce settlement, but something in his tone made me agree. We met at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between my house and his apartment, on a cold Saturday morning in February. Michael looked different when I saw him. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized him during the divorce were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He'd aged visibly. More gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes and mouth, a slump to his shoulders that suggested defeat. We ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, and for a long moment neither of us knew quite what to say. Finally, Michael took a deep breath and told me he owed me an apology. A real one, not the half-hearted attempts at reconciliation he'd made in the early days after I'd locked him out of the house. He said that over the past 3 years, he'd had a lot of time to think about what he'd done and what he'd lost. He'd been in therapy, working through the midlife crisis that had driven so many of his terrible decisions. He'd come to realize that his affair with Amber hadn't been about her or about me, but about his own fears of aging and becoming irrelevant. He'd seen me as a mirror reflecting his own aging, and rather than accepting that as a natural part of life, he'd tried to run from it by pursuing someone young enough to make him feel vital again. In the process, he'd destroyed the best thing in his life and hurt the people he was supposed to protect. I listened to his apology without interrupting, watching his face as he spoke and trying to gauge his sincerity. He admitted that he'd taken me for granted for years, that he'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own dreams and value, and had started viewing me as simply part of the household infrastructure, like the appliances or the furniture. He said he'd been cruel when he told me I was old and useless, that those words haunted him now, because he'd come to understand how much I'd sacrificed for our family, and how little he'd appreciated it. He acknowledged that trying to take the house from me had been not just legally wrong, but morally reprehensible, an attempt to erase my contributions and claim credit for something I'd created. Please subscribe to this channel to help us grow and reach more people with these real-life stories. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one makes a difference. I appreciated his apology, And I told him so, but I also told him that it didn't change anything between us. The damage he'd done wasn't the kind that could be repaired with acknowledgement and regret. He'd shown me who he really was when things got difficult, when his ego was threatened, when he felt the pull of something new and exciting. He'd chosen to betray and abandon me, to demean and devalue me, and those choices had consequences that couldn't be undone. I told him I forgave him, not for his sake, but for my own, because carrying anger and resentment was exhausting, and I'd already spent too many years letting his behavior determine my emotional state. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, or even friendship. It just meant I was letting go of the hope that he could have been different and accepting that he was exactly who he'd shown himself to be. Michael accepted this with a sad nod, and then he asked about my life, how I was doing, what I was working on. I told him about the architectural firm, about my projects and my travels, and my relationship with David. I could see something like regret, or maybe envy, cross his face, as he realized that I'd built a full, meaningful life without him, that his absence hadn't left a void, but had actually created space for me to flourish. He told me he was glad I was happy, and I think he meant it, even though it clearly hurt him to see how well I was doing while he struggled. We finished our coffee and said goodbye in the parking lot. Michael hesitated before getting in his car, as if he wanted to say something more, but ultimately he just gave me a small wave and drove away. I watched him go and felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. That conversation confirmed what I'd already known, that the man I'd married had been consumed by the person Michael had become, and that there was no going back to what we'd been. But it also freed me from any lingering questions about whether I'd been too harsh or unforgiving. I'd given him 23 years of my life, my youth and my career and my unwavering support, and he'd thrown it all away. I didn't owe him anything more. The architectural firm continued to grow and thrive. Diane and I won a major award for one of our community housing projects, recognition from the State Architectural Association for Innovative Sustainable Design. The award came with significant publicity, articles in professional journals and local newspapers, and it brought in even more clients. I was interviewed for a podcast about women in architecture who'd returned to the field after career breaks, and the response was overwhelming. Dozens of women reached out to tell me their own stories of putting careers on hold for family and struggling to find their way back. And several of them I was able to help with advice or connections, or even job opportunities at our firm. If you're enjoying this story and finding value in it, please consider subscribing to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support helps these stories reach more people who might need to hear them. David and I got engaged on a trip to Paris in the spring, 4 years after my divorce. It wasn't a dramatic proposal, just a quiet conversation over dinner at a small restaurant in the Marais about whether we wanted to officially commit to spending our lives together. We'd both been married before. We both understood that marriage was work and compromise and choosing each other every day, and we both felt ready to take that step. We got married that summer in a small ceremony in my garden, just our children and close friends, with Emma and Jake both standing up with me. It felt completely different from my first wedding, less about spectacle and more about genuine commitment, less about starting a new life and more about choosing to walk through life together as partners who genuinely valued each other. Michael sent a card when he heard about the wedding, a simple note congratulating me and wishing me happiness. There was no bitterness in it, just a quiet acknowledgement that I'd moved on and built something new. Emma told me later that he'd cried when she'd told him I was getting remarried. Not angry tears, but sad ones. The tears of someone who finally understood everything he'd lost. I felt sympathy for him in that moment, but it was distant. The way you might feel sympathy for any suffering person you don't really know anymore. David moved into my house after the wedding, and for the first time in years, I was sharing my space with someone again. But it felt completely different from living with Michael. David respected my need for independence and my career demands. He cooked dinner when I was working late on a project. He took genuine interest in my work and offered thoughtful input when I asked for it. He supported my decisions without trying to control or criticize them. We divided household responsibilities based on our actual preferences and abilities, rather than outdated gender roles. We talked about everything, our days and our dreams and our concerns, really talked in a way Michael and I never had. The house that had been my sanctuary of solitude became a home I genuinely wanted to share with someone who saw and valued me. Looking at my life now, 5 years after that devastating Tuesday morning when I discovered Michael's betrayal, I'm amazed at how much has changed. I'm 52 years old. I run a successful architectural firm. I'm married to someone who treats me as an equal partner. I have strong relationships with my adult children, and I live in a beautiful home that represents my independence and resilience. None of this was what I'd imagined my life would look like when I was standing in that bedroom watching my husband hand me divorce papers, while his mistress painted her nails with my nail polish. In that moment, I'd felt like my life was ending, like everything I'd built and believed in was crumbling around me. Please help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers by clicking that subscribe button. Every subscription supports the sharing of these real stories and helps build a community of people learning and growing together. But sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. Michael's betrayal forced me to rediscover parts of myself I'd buried or forgotten. His cruelty pushed me to fight for what was mine and to remember my own worth. His absence created space for me to build a life that actually reflected my values and desires, rather than being shaped around someone else's expectations and ego. In trying to make me disappear, in trying to erase my contributions and claim what I'd created, he actually gave me the opportunity to become more fully myself than I'd been in decades. I still have the house, of course, though it's evolved so much from what it was when Michael tried to take it from me. The structure is the same. The bones I designed all those years ago when I was still a wife trying to please her husband. But everything else has changed. It's filled with different furniture, different art, different energy. The ghosts of my first marriage have been exorcised by new memories, better memories of dinner parties with real friends, of late nights working on designs that challenge and excite me, of quiet mornings with a partner who actually sees me. The house that Michael called his, that he thought he could steal from me, that he imagined living in with his young mistress, is mine in ways he never understood or valued. Thank you so much for listening to my story all the way through. Thank you for being here, for caring about what happened to someone you've never met, for taking the time to hear about resilience and recovery and reclaiming yourself after someone tries to take everything from you. If my experience has resonated with you at all, if it's given you hope or perspective or just a reminder that you're not alone in facing difficult situations, please subscribe to this channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. These stories matter. Your story matters, and together we're building a community of people who understand that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and create the life you deserve. Thank you again, and remember that you are never too old, never too useless, never too anything to fight for your own happiness and dignity.